were you when the world stopped turning? That September day. Do you remember what you were doing, where you were, who you spoke to that morning on September 11th of 2001? I can remember very well what I was doing that morning, September 11th, 2001. At about 9 o'clock in the morning. I can remember my kids were off to school. My wife had gone to Walmart. I had spoken to my mom on the phone about my dad's viewing that was going to take place that night. I had the TV on and remember seeing the second plane hit the second tower, and then the collapse of the towers, the plane into the Pentagon, the plane going down in Jacksonville, and the news coverage was on the entire day. I remember the talk at work after going back to work a couple of days later. They were placing concrete walls around the FBI building down in Woodlawn, placing concrete walls and shutting down all the streets down around the Baltimore City Police Headquarters down on Fayette Street, putting up concrete walls about Baltimore County Police Headquarters down on Joppa Road in Towson, periodic checks of all the bridges on Interstate 70 and 83, 95, 695, the federal buildings all being cordoned off, heightened lookouts for suspicious activities. I remember talking with a friend at work. It was a firefighter from Hereford. He was absolutely at awe that the very previous weekend, prior to 9/11, that he was in New York, riding with the members of Rescue 5. His visit to New York that weekend was to visit his fellow brothers firefighters at Rescue 5, and he had went to a cookout with the people at Rescue 5. He had also been to visit one of the members of Rescue 5 that was currently in the hospital. And he even finished off the trip riding on Rescue 5, riding with all but one of the crew that was lost when the towers came down. He had gone up in the elevators just prior to that weekend prior to 9/11, gone up in the elevators of the World Trade Center to the observation deck, and he had showed me photos that he had taken that very weekend prior to 9/11. Not knowing what was to come a few days later. He was at all because he was back here in the States. He was out of State Highway working, and he was out of Hereford driving a fire truck, and he was absolutely at all that he was up there that prior weekend, and that those very people that he rode with on Rescue 5, all but one, were lost when the towers came down. Where were you when the world stopped turning that September day? Do you remember? Today we gather to say that we remember the day the world stopped turning, the day of the attacks in New York and Washington and Jacksonville, the attacks to our American peace on September 11, 2001. We are here to remember those who still hurt, the thousands of men and women who put on a uniform and served their city, their community, their county, their country, and especially those who have given their lives since that day seeking to destroy the forces that plotted their evil. It affects just about everyone. There are people still serving today in Afghanistan and Iraq, our armed forces that are still out there today serving our country. The lives that were touched as a result of the events of 9/11 are in hundreds of thousands, if not millions. All of us probably know someone who have heard of someone touched by the attacks. It touches us here especially because it hit here at home with us. With my son-in-law having to go serving 2 tours, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan, and we were one of those families that had to say goodbye while he left us for a while. The lives that were touched on 9/11. The casualties of 9/11. 2,752 in the World Trade Center towers, 189 casualties in the Pentagon, 45 casualties in Shanksville, and as of this date, 4,474 casualties for our armed forces in Iraq, 1,645 casualties in the war in Afghanistan. We remember today 9,105 lives lost to this date as a result of the events of 9/11, 2001. It affects just the extended families also. All the extended families have been touched by the events of 9/11. The number of people who have lost a spouse in the attacks, 1,609. The estimated number of children who lost a parent in the attacks on September 11th, 2001, 3,051. Jobs lost in New York alone, owning up to the attacks, is 146,000. Number of Americans affected by the events of 9/11 is estimated at 1.4 million people. 1.4 million people whose lives were touched as a result of the events of 9/11. And that statistic was from 2006. We are now in 2011, so you can imagine what the extended families that have been touched. The estimated number of New Yorkers still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of 9/11 in New York, 422,000. There was a firefighter from Hereford that just recently gave this an account of searching the rubble in the World Trade Center. The memories of searching through the rubble of the fallen World Trade Center towers in New York are forever seared into Mark Gardner's mind and soul. What happened on 9/11 will always be a part of us and part of me, says Mark. He's from Carpton. He's a Baltimore County firefighter at Station 17 down in Cockeysville. He's also a volunteer firefighter with Hereford. Mark says, I'll think of the 60 police officers and 343 firefighters who just break down at times. Mark knows that at the next few weeks leading up to this 10th anniversary, the article says that he will have some tough times ahead of him, bringing up all those memories and remembering what he did for 9/11. September 12, 2001 for Mark was a bright, clear, sunny day. And the first thing he saw pulling into New York on the bus was a huge airplane wheel sitting in the middle of the street. The rubble was 7 or 8 stories high. There wasn't anything recognizable. No office furniture, no computers, no walls, no doors. It was a surreal scene. He and his team spent much of the day crawling into spaces created when the towers fell, hoping that someone was still alive, trapped in the debris. When rescuers thought they heard tapping or a sound from the debris, all work stopped. After a minute or two of complete silence, they started digging again. Let us today also remember that with tragedy comes hope. With hurt, there comes hope. With loss, there comes hope. With sadness, there comes hope. There is hope in tragedy. Along with so many accounts of loss, also come many testimonies from 9/11 of hope and healing. I'm just going to share with you a couple testimonies this morning of what God has done for some people, some of those that have been touched on 9/11. One such testimony comes from 2 pastors who each pastored churches directly within the vicinity of the World Trade Centers. One of those churches is right across the street. The backside of the church was right across the street from the World Trade Center. They were both right in the line of collapse when the towers came down. Reverend Harris and Reverend Hope, pastors of St. Paul's Chapel and Trinity Church in New York, remember where they were and their feeling of shock and concern. Their concern was for their churches. St. Paul stood in the shadow of the Twin Towers, and Reverend Harris feared that when he made his way into the city, to where the church stood, he would find nothing but ruins after seeing the plane go into the towers on the TV. All around the church there was debris of the World Trade Center, and the church lawn was debris from the World Trade Center. Dust was all over the place. Yet, miracle of miracles, St. Paul's Chapel was unharmed. The church itself was unharmed. The chapel was unharmed. The chapel where George Washington had prayed had still stood, except for a fallen tree limb from a large sycamore that, believe it or not, took the brunt when the debris fell towards that church. The sycamore that the pastor believes God placed in that place for the right time to save the church. 4 toppled tombstones and a thick layer of dust in the chapel was spared. His testimony, Jesus said about his church, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Reverend Hope remembers where he was. He was at Trinity Church, also in the shadows of the Twin Towers. The church was a place where persons sought refuge. They ran into his church, escaping from the collapsing towers. Reverend Hope began church service at 9:53 a.m. September 11th, 2001. He began a prayer service. As the lights went out, the church was filled with the debris, the dust of the collapsed South Tower. Police and firefighters came in and ordered the building evacuated. And as they left, Reverend Hope asked the 30 people that were there, joining him in prayer, to join him in singing as they left the building. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Jesus said about his church, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. These 2 churches became places of refuge and hope during the events, the days after 9/11. Because their buildings were spared, neither church was damaged. The church doors were opened to serve. The church doors were open to offer hope to the hurting in New York. The church doors were open to reach out to the firefighters and the police officers and anyone needing hope at that time. Hope and healing the church offered.